Good morning, everybody. I guess we are about 1 week out from Purim, so happy belated Purim here, but we can bring in a little bit of the Purim spirit and keep talking about Esther for at least another couple minutes here. So as I said before, there's sort of a mystery at the center of Jewish history, and it's actually fascinating how little scholars know about the actual history behind this topic. And, you can devour articles and books and podcasts about this topic, and virtually all of them end with, but really we have no idea. And so there's, again, this wider question mark when it comes to canonization. And this is true on an intellectual framework, whether we're talking about Judaism, we could even talk about perhaps the American high school curriculum of who decided which books we should read and why are some books sort of codified to be extremely important, and other books, after they're written 5-10 years later, nobody's ever heard of them. And there's always two minds here, right? So you can imagine the two extremes of the argument, and we'll probably present something a little bit more in the middle, right? On the one hand, you can try to argue that this is sort of all a historical accident. And so, right, this is sort of the random theory, and basically trying to go and put back the pieces as to, let's say, why The Great Gatsby and 1984 and Scarlet Letter are all books that I read in middle school, and somebody else can name 6 books that I probably never heard of before. Perhaps that's just an accident, right? These first section of books were in the right place at the right time, right? They ended up getting pushed to the right publicists. They perhaps came onto the scene at a time in American history where these issues were extremely important, but perhaps there's nothing, quote unquote, objectively better about these 3 books that I just listed than other books, right? It just so happened that it was a historical accident. On the other hand, we can take the opposite extreme position, and we can say, no, in some essential way, these 3 books are just better for their category than all other books. And so if you want to teach about, let's say, the dangers of groupthink and governmental takeover, 1984 is the best book. And if you want to talk about class dynamics, Great Gatsby is the best book. And so we can apply the same conversation to Tanakh, as we'll try to do. And there's a fascinating thing when we look through Tanakh. So just to share my screen a little bit, so we can, instead of pointing to a bookshelf as I would do if we were in a Beit Midrash, we can just go through sort of the wider story of Tanakh, because something very interesting happens where, of course, we're just a brief summary. So we're all probably familiar with, again, the 5 books of Moses, right? This is pretty standard. I'm calling it Orthodox, but I don't mean, contemporary Jewish Orthodoxy. I mean mainstream Jewish tradition, that if you were trying to teach somebody the wider biblical philosophy on one foot, you would probably say, well, God created the world, and God took the Israelites out of Egypt and then brought them into a land of milk and honey, and then the Israelites built the temple, and then you had this navigation between the prophetic critique of temple. And this is sort of the mainstream story of Tanakh that we teach, and it's basically true. And that runs from Genesis all the way down to past the prophets. And then all of a sudden, and what we're going to be focusing on for the next 2 weeks, is all of a sudden we get to this last third, which are writings. And this really does seem like an ad hoc patchwork of different books. And so we're going to be discussing a couple of these, but really our wider conversation can be applied to all of these. So we mentioned Shir Hashirim, Song of Songs before. So just to pick a couple of them that we'll be focusing on. So Sefaria is always great, by the way. It's always great when Sefaria gives their 1-sentence translation of what the book is, because already with Song of Songs, as we'll be discussing more in depth next week, we already see some sort of alarm bells going off, because it says poetic conversation of 2 lovers. Okay, anybody who's read Shir Hashirim, it really does read like erotic poetry. Traditionally read as a metaphor for God and Israel, right? So we already see something's wrong, right? This entire book was so, for lack of a better word, unkosher, that the entire interpretation of the book has been changed. And this is actually, if you go to some bookshelves today, I remember growing up, I grew up in a pretty standard Orthodox community. And so all of our translations of texts were art scroll. And I remember it took me until late high school to ever understand what Shir Hashirim was actually saying, because Shir Hashirim in Hebrew is dense Hebrew poetry. So it's very hard to understand. So of course, growing up, whenever the community would read it, I would always grab the English version and skim along. And I read the Art Scroll version, which was not a translation. The entire thing was an interpretive analysis of Song of Songs. And it took me till years later to realize, wait a minute, if the original text says, "Come, my lover, I will kiss you on your breast," why does the interpretation say, "The day that the Israelites received the Torah was the day of great joy," right? What is the crossover here? And so already we see with these books, right? There's a little bit of implicit challenging of tradition, right? Well, I'll go to one more that I don't think we're going to spend a lot of time discussing, but you can equally apply this framework to. The book of Ruth is also equally fascinating, just in terms of Tanakh, because of course, most of Tanakh is trying to forge national identity. And so if you actually read, let's say, the books that come historically right before Ruth, you read the book Ezra and Nehemiah, it's these stories of the Israelites after the Persians allow them to return to Israel. It's the story of really ethnocentricity, and the Israelites are returning to Israel, and there's this famous speech that Ezra gives where he tells all of the now they're called Jews, because this is, of course, once they forged their Jewish identity in Babylonia. And he has this famous speech telling them, you guys all seem to have married nice non-Jewish women when you were in exile, right? Now go send them away, right? We've returned to Israel. We're rebuilding the temple, right? It's time to get serious again. And the book of Ruth was written basically right after that. And the entire book of Ruth is a story of bringing people into the community, right? It's a story of, I don't want to call it intermarriage, but that quite literally is what it is, right? It's where we get our framework for an inclusivity of a community of inclusivity, where we allow people to enter into the community. And even, I'm not saying worse in a moral sense, even worse from a traditional Jewish sense, Ruth is a Moabite woman. And if you read through the books of Deuteronomy and later books, the Deuteronomist history hates Moabite women, right? Over and over again, we're told, do not let Moabites come into the camp. And so just as some examples here and there, and we can read the entirety of the last third of Tanakh as these books that implicitly challenge tradition. And a lot of times, the last thing I'll say by introduction is that Judaism is obviously a tradition where we don't all agree, right? I think that's probably an understatement, but we're a tradition that inspires paradoxy or inspires an iconoclastic nature. And I don't think that this is a historical accident. I think that this really actually starts in the Tanakh. And one of the amazing things that we can see with Tanakh, right? Classically, there's 24 books in Tanakh. We really do get almost 24 different religious philosophies throughout our tradition. And so we can really read Tanakh, and it's almost impossible to agree with all of it because there are blatant contradictions. It is very hard to reconcile the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Ecclesiastes, and we'll go over that a little bit next week. But these books open up a framework for a multiplicity of opinions and perspectives on Judaism. And so I think that Esther is actually one of the best examples of this. And I know about a week ago for Temple Beth Tikva, we did some of these texts, but I changed it up a little bit because I really want to focus on this question of canonization and what was happening here. But just to go back to some base sources, and this is one of my favorite sources about Esther, because there's already this implicit problem when it comes to the book of Esther, and I'll zoom in a little bit, which is Esther notoriously, right, has no God in it. Esther has no religion. Esther has a strong female lead, which, aside for the couple chapters that Deborah the prophetess gets, right, that is virtually unheard of in the Tanakh. And just the general nature of Esther. I mean, reading the book of Esther twice over Purim, I'm always struck by just how not religious of a book this seems. And almost one way to think of this is, right, people who grow up in the Jewish community are so used to every year hearing Esther sort of refracted through the framework of our tradition. So of course we talk about the hidden hand of God and all of these things, but if we just handed Esther to a group of people, right, imagine we have a group of people that have never heard of the Jewish tradition before, and we gave them Esther, they would probably assume correctly that this book has no place in a classic religious bookshelf. And so the rabbis, of course, were attuned to this problem. We're going to work a little bit historically backwards. And this is one of my favorite sources about Esther, and it appears in the Talmud of Chulin, which ironically is the Talmudic tractate where we get a lot of our laws of kosher. And the rabbis ask a very innocuous question. And I love it when the rabbis do this, because they ask, where is Esther indicated in the Torah? And I love it when the rabbis do this because this question makes no sense, right? Anybody with a third grade Jewish education knows that Esther takes place after the Torah ends, right? The Torah ends off with Moses about to cross over into the Jordan. Esther, the setting is about 500-600 years later in the Persian Empire. And so what do the rabbis mean when they ask where Esther is indicated in the Torah, right? Do they want the answer to be, no, sorry, you're thinking of the wrong book, right? Esther's not in the Torah. But this is the rabbi's way of telling you two things. One, it's telling you that there is something fishy with Esther, right? There's some reason why we need to retroactively kosher the book of Esther, right? Because if Daniel, the random rabbi in 2023 comes up with something and I write a book, right? That's just hearsay. But if my inspiration, if my source material was from the Torah, right, that already gives it a heightened magnitude. We'll actually see this even more next week, where when we get to later books of Tanakh, as I was saying before, right, two of the most famous that pop out are the book of Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs. Now, if you go to a introductory or a advanced upper division graduate school class analyzing these books, and the professor asks, when were these books written? The answer seems very simple, right? These books were written under Greek rule, right? There was a time in Jewish history for many hundred years after Alexander the Great takes over that the Jewish people are under this encroaching Hellenistic rule, right? We have the entire story of Hanukkah to commemorate this time in our history. And we know that Greek influence was getting more and more palpable within the Jewish community, right? Many Jews, if we took a time machine 2,200 years ago and landed in the land of Israel or in north of Egypt in Alexandria, your average Jew was speaking Greek, just as your average Jew in America today is speaking English. And just like a lot of 21st century American ideas and terms and philosophies are now very commonplace, even in our Jewish community, right? The Jewish community back then was obviously engaged in Greek ideas. And so Song of Songs reads like erotic Greek love poetry. And the book of Ecclesiastes reads like a Stoic or Epicurean reflection on the world and trying to find meaning. If you ask the Talmud, and we'll discuss this a little bit more next week, well, who wrote these books? The Talmud famously says, well, these books were written by King Solomon, right? King Solomon, who is purported by our tradition to be the wisest man who ever lived, right? These books were written by King Solomon, right? Not some group of Hellenized Jews in the 2nd or 3rd century. Now we take a step back and we ask, well, why, right? What is the point of accrediting a book to a much later source? And the answer is the same as the source in Chulin, right? It retroactively koshers a source by saying that it wasn't some random guy, me in the year 2023 who wrote something. This is actually ancient wisdom that has been uncovered. Perhaps another class we can talk about the same thing about the Zohar, right? That is attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai when really it was written in medieval Spain. But anyway, enough of those tangents, right? So the Talmud wants to know, where do we find Esther in the Torah, right? So already a weird question and already highlighting the fact that the rabbis are uncomfortable with the book of Esther and need to kosher it. And they quote this very strange verse. They quote this verse from the end of Deuteronomy, and the source of this verse in Deuteronomy is Moses basically laying down all of the terrible things that will happen if the Israelites are unfaithful, right? And so this is just a laundry list of, if you go astray and serve other gods, there's going to be plague, there's going to be famine, right? Your sons and daughters are going to be killed, right? Just the worst curses you can give. And towards the end, Moses, who's speaking on behalf of God, says, on that day, I will surely hide my face on that day. The word for hiding in Hebrew famously is Esther, right? So the Hebrew goes, "V'anochi estir et panai b'yom hazeh," right? I will hide my face, right? And the rabbis notice a play on words here, and they say, Esther means hiding. God said he's going to hide. Well, where better do we find a time in our history where tragedy and calamity has struck and God is nowhere to be found than the book of Esther? And so they're almost introducing the book of Esther as, hey, everybody, here is this text that is, in some way, at least the beginning of it, is the fulfillment of this darkest prophecy that Moses is foretelling for our people. This is going to be a day where there's going to be terrible tragedy, and God is not going to be there to bail you out. And what do you know? We hop to the book of Esther, and this is exactly what happens, right? Haman, right? We don't need to go over the story too much, but just famously, Haman, who is the evil advisor to either the evil or foolish, you can decide at home, King Ahasuerus, decides that he wants to commit genocide for the Jewish people. And unlike every other book of Tanakh, where calamity strikes and immediately you have this prayer session or you have this sacrificial session, right? We can even think this past week, the parsha was Kitisa with the golden calf, right? Immediately after Moses comes down and smashes the tablets, he then engages with God for what seems like hours when you're actually reading the verses, right? And they go back and forth, and he says, please, God, right? Don't punish the people, right? They don't know what they're doing, right? If you're going to punish them, punish me with them. And you have this dialogue between Moses and God trying to mediate. And we actually get a lot of our language for the high holidays from this Torah portion of Moses begging God to not punish the Israelites. There is none of that in Esther, right? There's none of the Israelites going out or the Jews going out and sitting there and communally praying and singing and trying to offer sacrifices and all these things. And so the Talmud gets spot on here, but almost in an ironic sense of introducing the book of Esther as there's going to be this book and God is not going to be anywhere to be found. Marsha, did you have?
I'm just sharing this with you as I'm listening to you. When I read the story of Esther, I also marvel at the question, like there is no indication of what Jewish life might have been even like in that time. You don't get a sense of anything. The only thing you know, just like Shylock is a Jew in Merchant of Venice, but we don't know anything about how he lives or his family. We don't know anything about what was Jewish about the life of Mordecai and Esther. And why was Mordecai, I'm just putting this out here, the only person who didn't want to bow down to Haman? Were the rest of the Jews bowing down because it was just easier to go with the flow? I mean, these are questions that the whole story begs with all of these unclear things. So I just wanted to.
No, 100%. It's a great point. And it's funny because even in the beginning of the story, right, famously, the story opens with this, multi-month party that Ahasuerus throws. And one of the famous verses is sort of the wine was free flowing, right? Everybody had whatever choice wine. And presumably, right, this isn't explicit, but it's sort of obvious from the text that all of the Jews were going to this party, or, the top Jewish community. And so you have, all of the Jews at this massive party of King Ahasuerus. And if we sort of had, 10 hours to go over this, there's a really interesting read of the first chapter of the book of Esther, especially when it's describing King Ahasuerus' palace and the party and the vessels, that it actually reflects a lot of the discussion of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem. And so you have this fascinating interplay where it almost seems like, right, one reading of the book of Esther that I think is very interesting, that the entire point of Esther, right, there was a time in our history, right, it's very unclear when exactly Esther happened, but there was a time in history, right, just to review, right, we were in exile in Babylonia for 70 years, from 586 to about 516, right? King Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple, the Persian Empire takes over, famously King Cyrus allows the Jews to return. But what do you know, after 70 years of living in Babylonia, the vast majority of Jews opt to not return to Israel, right? Not dissimilar, I'll just say, to Jews in America, and I'll include myself here, that in Passover in 3 weeks, I'm going to say with all of my kavana and inspiration next year in Jerusalem, knowing full well that I have the ability to live next year in Jerusalem, and I probably won't, right? And this is just some of the tensions of what it means to be a Jew in the modern world, right? This was quite evidently the case 2,500 years ago, because King Cyrus issues his famous Cyrus cylinder and allows all exiles to come back to their former lands. And most of the Jews say, well, thank you, but we're going to stay here in Babylonia, right? The crops are good, right? Business is doing well, right? Life seems pretty good here. And so, of course, some smaller group of Jews end up going back to Jerusalem. But it's here that I think the most provocative reading of Esther starts, right? You can almost imagine this split screen happening in the beginning of Esther, where on the one side, you zoom in Jerusalem and you see them setting up this second temple. And famously, the second temple was not as beautiful as the first, right? It actually says that the elders, right, in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, the elders who had been there for the first temple immediately started to cry once the inauguration of the second temple happened, because they knew that things would never be the same and it wasn't as good. So you imagine on the one hand, this sort of, I don't want to say this sad group of Jews, but this, again, this sad group of Jews stuck in the past, going back to Jerusalem, building the temple, which is not as nice as the first. And on the same time, you imagine the Jews of Shushan going to this massive party that looks like the temple. They're using vessels that actually the Midrash says were stolen from the temple. They're drinking wine and meat, right? All things that were consumed in the temple. And so you can imagine that the first chapter of the book of Esther meant that the Jews actually replaced religious life to some extent with wider Persian party culture, for lack of a better term. And so it's a fascinating read, but it gets at what Rav Marsha was saying before, which is the book of Esther just seems not religious at all, right? Like Mordecai and Esther, if you picture them in your head, right? I remember just one more story as a child, and then we'll get into some actual sources, right? You have all these Jewish children's books. And so all these books, whenever they present, Jewish characters in the past, they always anachronistically portray them as if they're, from the 20th century. And so, I had my picture book of, Moses leading the Jews out of Egypt. And of course, Moses had side locks and a kippah and wearing a talit katan, which of course, none of that had been invented yet. But to some extent, that makes sense with Moses. Okay, let's portray him as the man of tradition. Even now, when I picture Mordecai and Esther, I picture really secular people. I mean, it almost sounds strange to see, but Mordecai makes more sense to me as a non-kippah wearing, civically engaged Jew than he does the Jew that's showing up for Shabbat morning davening every week. And actually, just one more thing, because the Midrash picks up on this, and the Midrash writes, and this is a fascinating Midrash on a piece of rabbinic commentary on the book of Esther, and it said that the Sanhedrin, so the Jewish court, actually disapproved of everything that Mordecai and Esther were doing, because they point out they were engaging in all of the things against our tradition, right? They are engaging in wider secular culture. They're going to secular courts. Esther, of course, is marrying the king, right? There's adultery going on, which our tradition says you should actually lay down your life for. And so the Midrash actually tries to read this as a religious battle happening, where Mordecai and Esther are the more secular wing of the Jewish community, which I think makes a lot of sense. So we get into, right, the book of Esther, which again, for all these reasons, is problematic. And so you can imagine, if you're the leader in the Jewish community, and especially later on, as you're trying to consolidate tradition to a monolithic view, this view of tradition, and I'll unshare my screen for a minute so we can all see each other and engage in some conversation here, right? That the book of Esther is, for all these reasons, heterodox, unorthodox, right, going against the grain. And so you have a couple of options here. And one of the things that we'll do is we can run through a couple of the options, and then we can lay out the thesis, which will continue more next week in terms of canonization of Tanakh. But your couple options go as follows. One is you could completely throw away this book, right? You can try to pretend like the book doesn't exist. And that is one such option, and we can see how that worked or didn't work out, right? Two is you could accept this book, but with radical reinterpretation, that's actually, if you look at a lot of contemporary Jewish communities, I was joking before about Art Scroll's translation of Song of Songs, but to some extent, that is one contemporary Jewish reading of Esther. Or the last way that you can do it is you can actually try to edit the Book of Esther. And this is one of the most interesting facets of Esther. And so just to go into taking a step back and laying down the history. So scholars think that Esther was finally written about 4th or 3rd century BCE. So now we're thinking 300s, maybe the early 200s BCE. And this is right in early Greek rule, right? If we're more historically focused, Alexander the Great was the year 333 BCE. And so all of a sudden you get this massive Jewish Hellenistic tension that's happening that we all know from the Hanukkah story. And one of the main historical documents to come out of this time, and this is something that sociologically is important to understand because we do the same thing in America as American Jews all the time, is, of course, if you are a Jew who's going to synagogue on Shabbat or Passover or Purim, you probably are not an expert in Hebrew. And so for the first time in Jewish history, as Jews are assimilating more and more into wider Greek culture, there now becomes a gulf between the language of religious life and the language of civic life. And this is something that didn't exist in the times of the First Temple, because in the times of the First Temple, everybody spoke Hebrew, and Hebrew was the language of religious texts, right? It's almost the difference between an Israeli growing up with their understanding of Jewish texts and an American Jew, right? In the American Jewish community, we have to invest a ton of time and effort and resources in teaching people Hebrew. And right, and it's extremely important, but think of how much time and effort we take going into that, right? When people get their bar bat mitzvahs. And if somebody grows up in Israel, right, that's of course the language that they're speaking from 4 years old, right? And so all of a sudden, when this gulf appears, you need translation. And there's a lot of really interesting scholarship on translation theory and what exactly is a translation trying to do, and is there such thing as a pure translation that's not a commentary? But one of the things that we get is the Septuagint, and the Septuagint ends up being one of the most important and fascinating ancient historical documents, because the Septuagint is the first translation, the first full translation of Tanakh in our history. And so what happened was the Jewish leaders got together, and the Jewish leaders said, well, it turns out that most of our community is not speaking Hebrew first, right? They're assimilating more and more into Greek ideas and Greek ideology. And so if we want to push Judaism as an equally deep philosophy of life, we need to make sure this is in a language they can understand. By the way, just an interesting historical sidebar, this happened many other times in our history, right? This happened with Sadia Gaon, the Babylonian sage, when he interpreted the Torah into Arabic. This happened with Moses Mendelssohn, the early founder or inspirer of the Reform movement, when he interpreted the Torah into High German, right? This, of course, happened many times in America as the Torah continuously is interpreted, right? It seems like every 5 years there's a new translation coming out from the American Jewish community. And so we get this first translation of the Book of Esther, and we're flipping through the Septuagint, and for most of it, it seems very normal. And all of a sudden, we get this wild section where I will show it right here. So I picked a random part of the Septuagint translation here. When I went over some similar source material last week, I picked a different one. But let's just pick one of the most notorious parts of the Book of Esther, right? Where Haman is telling Achashverosh, there's a group of people that are scattered and you should kill them, right? In the original version, that's all Haman says, right? There's a group of people, they're scattered, they do things a little bit differently, right? It would not be in your it would not be great for you to tolerate them. Here is how the Septuagint translates this. When I asked my counselors how this might be accomplished, Haman, who excels among us in sound judgment and is distinguished for his unchanging goodwill and steadfast fidelity, has attained second place in the kingdom, pointed out to us among the nations of the world, there is a certain hostile people who have laws contrary to those of every nation and continuously disregard the ordinance of kings so that the unifying of the kingdom that we honorably intend cannot brought about. We understand that this people and it alone stands constantly in opposition to every nation, perversely following a strange manner of life and laws, and is ill disposed to our government, doing all the harm that they could, that our kingdom may not attain stability, right? So already, right, we get a completely different translation because the original makes it seem like the Jews are just spread around, right? Maybe they're a little bit different, but there's no distinguishing factor. Here in the Septuagint version, all of a sudden we start to get the Jews have different laws, the Jews have different customs, they're doing things differently, right? Almost trying to take this model of Mordechai and Esther as irreligious folks and try to portray them as religious people. And the Septuagint is almost rewriting the book of Esther and saying, no, don't think, right? Don't you dare do what Rabbi Marsha and Daniel just tried to do. Don't you dare say these were a bunch of secular people. Even Haman himself points out they had all these laws and customs that were different, right? We scroll down in the Septuagint version more to another fascinating part, which is right after Mordechai hears about the genocide of the Jews, the translators of the Septuagint insert in a full paragraph, which starts off, then Mordechai prayed to the Lord, calling to remember all the works of the Lord. Now, we take a step back and we say, what's going on here? There's no God in the original Esther, and it seems like the writers or the translators of the Septuagint added in a full section. And I'm not going to read this because you all know what a deep, heartfelt prayer is like, but this prayer goes on for many, many lines. And we go later into the Megillah, and now we get Esther praying, right? Gathering all of her folks and praying. And she says, again, remember, O Lord, make yourself known in time of the affliction. Give me courage, right? And it goes on and on and on. And we can see paragraph after paragraph of addition into the book of Esther, adding in religious elements. I mean, the Septuagint, and what's fascinating about the Septuagint is this was not a text that was written, 10 years ago by the ultra-Orthodox community to sort of edit and redact Jewish books. This is a 2,200-year-old translation that attempts to retroactively kosher the book of Esther by editing it. I mean, it's a fascinating historical act of revisionism. And actually, one interesting facet of here is a lot of Catholic communities who still use the Septuagint version. This is the version of Esther they use. I remember a couple of years ago, I was talking to a bunch of friends of mine who are Catholic, and we were talking about the book of Esther. And it was before I realized that the Catholic community, at least some subset of it, uses the Septuagint. And we were talking about the book. And after about 10 minutes, I paused and I said, we are talking about very different books. Which book are you talking about? And he grabbed his Bible and showed it to me. And I was like, oh, this is the Septuagint version. He's like, what do you mean? And I was like, well, we use the Masoretic version, right? Here it is. And he was stunned, said, I've never seen this, right? What is this book? And I was like, this is the original. And right, it was a fascinating conversation. And that conversation might have exactly mirrored, if you can imagine an ancient conversation happening in, say, Alexandria in the year 200, where you have Jewish communities that every Purim get together and are reading this version, and other Jewish communities that are saying, you know what, we're going to take the original, even if the original seems to give certain heterodox ideas. And so we go back to sort of our main thesis here, right, with the Septuagint. And one such answer that you can have for difficult texts in Tanakh is, of course, you can redact them and you can edit them, right? And so one approach, right? So if we're thinking of this from a big canonization approach of what do you do when there are books and there are texts that to some extent have already circulated in the community long enough that people are not going to let them go, right? The writers of the Septuagint probably felt that they weren't able to just decide the book of Esther was no longer valuable. They edit it and they make sure that you never have a case where some guy named Daniel in 2023 is going to pick up the book of Esther and is going to say, hey, you know what, guys, this is giving a model of Jewish community and civic life outside of religion, right? What a wild idea, right? An idea that we all take for granted, right? Today, if I ask, can you be an involved Jew in the Jewish community, but be not very religious? everybody would say, of course, right? The religious and theological part of Jewish life, it's important, but it's not all encompassing, right? We all know people, right? And perhaps many of us too are less theologically invested in Jewish life and more culturally or more politically or more peoplehood focused in terms of Jewish life. And this is a model that has been in our tradition for thousands of years. But if you're trying to change this, say you're under attack from Hellenistic ideas, and your job is to combat Hellenistic ideas with traditional Jewish ideas, you're going to want to edit the Septuagint. The next attempt is even more fun. And the next attempt, we have to travel a couple years forward in history to Qumran, which for anybody who's had a chance to travel in Israel, I highly recommend. It's about, probably 40 miles from Jerusalem, but can take a whole day to get there because you're going through the Judean hills. And Qumran is a site that is right on the edge of the Dead Sea, right? This is a picture of Qumran, right? You can see it on the map here, right? It's on the north of the Dead Sea. Usually when people vacation in the Dead Sea, they're more in the south. This is where all the resorts are, right by En Gedi, right? So Qumran is at a very seldom traveled to area in the Dead Sea. And the sort of lore goes that in 1947, a group of Arab shepherds were walking through the desert and they were throwing rocks. And all of a sudden, one of the rocks hops into this cave that we can see here, and he just hears vessels shattering. And so, of course, they run into the cave and they uncover dozens, or over the course of years, of course, dozens, if not hundreds of scrolls that have become to known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, which by virtually all accounts is either the most important, second most important Jewish archaeological discovery in our history, right? Maybe the Cairo Geniza, right? One day we can have that debate, but the Dead Sea Scrolls is the most important archaeological discovery because we had no biblical texts from before the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so when scholars wanted to try to figure out, okay, when do you date texts? When was the first time we had the entirety of the Tanakh? When was the Tanakh canonized, right? All these questions that scholars are debating about. The Dead Sea Scrolls was the first time we said, well, here is the library of an ancient Jewish community, right? Here it is. The Dead Sea Scrolls has fascinating sociological and political and philosophical disagreements with what they call the wicked people in the temple time. And we start to learn more and more about this sort of a collective group that scholars are calling the Essenes, or Josephus called the Essenes, but scholars connect to be the Essenes. And they were this renegade break-off Jewish group in the first century. And this is going to be the first century BCE. And for a whole variety of reasons, they were becoming increasingly upset with the corruption in Jerusalem, right? Just a sidebar, after the Maccabees and Hasmonean dynasty took over in the Hanukkah story, the next 150 years of Jewish history was a series of increased religious and political corruption in the Jewish world. And one of the things that this is too politically ironic to not mention, given what's happening in Israel with the attempted judiciary reform, the worst thing that the Maccabees did from the point of view of classical Jewish thought is, for a very long time, Judaism preserved the separation of powers, right? We had the high priest and we had the king. And by definition, they had to come from different tribes. And so you always maintained a separation of power where no dynasty could take over. And so it's not like, say, Marsha can say, well, I'm both the high priest and I'm going to make my husband the king, and then our kids are going to both be high priests and kings, right? Because you have to maintain separation of powers. The Hasmonean dynasty collapsed both of them. So for the first time in Jewish history, you had no checks and balances. And well, what do you know? In a society, when you take away checks and balances, right, corruption brews and hostility brews. And so the Hasmonean period, right, there's a reason why most Jews don't talk much about the aftermath of the Hanukkah story, right? We all focus on the battle and the oil, and it seems like after the 8 days, the story just ends, even though the next 100, 150 years were really a rough patch in history. And so the Essenes, for all these reasons, were getting increasingly upset with what was going on. And so they decide, right, we're moving, right, let's take our community, we're going to set up a utopia in the desert. We're going to live an extremely ascetic lifestyle. We're going to focus heavily on the laws of purity and impurity. We're not going to take any pleasures, right? We're going to leave the wine at home. We're going to leave the oil at home. At some point in their history, I probably have quoted this in this group before. This is just my favorite fun fact about the Essenes. At about the third generation, scholars assume that they actually decided to kick out all of the women in their group. And so they, of course, quickly died out after that. And so, right, there's this group that lasted for 3-4 generations. And so why am I bringing you this? Well, scholars, of course, found several copies of the Tanakh all throughout these caves, but they were missing one book, right? There was no Esther. And so it's this fascinating glimpse into this break-off community that was upset with the corruption and what they considered the overindulgency of the Jerusalem upper class, that if you read their other writings, they say, well, these are a group of people that are too materialistic. They have their wine and their oil and free-flowing, and right, they're not religious enough and all the things. And they also don't bring the book of Esther. And it became too much to explain away by coincidence. I mean, they found like 6 or 7 copies of Joshua, right? Many copies of all the other books, but there was no Esther. And so scholars conclude, of course, that they were too religious for the book of Esther. Now, it's a fascinating thing to hear, because today, the book of Esther has equal religious value as most of our other religious texts, right? It's in the Tanakh. Right, we have an entire celebration where, by Jewish law, for those who are practicing Jewish law, you have to hear the book of Esther twice, and it's always so funny because for Monday night I was in a Orthodox synagogue, and before the book of Esther, the rabbi gets up and says, this is an extremely important book. You have to hear every single word. If the booing of Haman lasts even 20 seconds too long and you miss the next word, the entire reading is invalidated. And it's this fascinating glimpse of, okay, now the book of Esther has become a extremely religious book, to the extent that if you miss a word, your entire hearing of the book from some Orthodox perspective is invalidated. And all of a sudden you see this quote unquote more religious, right? I hate using the term more or less, but more traditionalist, more conservative community, the Essenes in the 1st century BCE, deciding that they are going to not bring the book of Esther altogether, which tells you a couple things. One, it confirms our hypothesis that this book is strange, heterodox, presenting ideas that a more traditionalist or conservative approach to Judaism would rather leave behind, just like the Septuagint. And 2, more interestingly, at least for the purpose of this conversation, it means that the book of Esther was not canonized at this point, because if it was canonized, if it sort of had that stamp of approval of this is part of the Tanakh, this is part of the group of books that are divinely inspired, you can't toss out a book that's divinely inspired. When it comes to other books, right, the book of Maccabees, the book of Ben Sira, the book of Jubilees, right, all these books that perhaps we've heard of, perhaps we haven't, right, these are all books that were written at the same time, and they were never given the stamp of divine approval. And so even though most of what we know from the Hanukkah story is from the book of Maccabees, there's no public reading of the book of Maccabees. We have 8 days of Hanukkah by which we can read it. I mean, the book of Maccabees is very short. If the rabbis wanted to sneak in a ritual reading of the book of Maccabees on Hanukkah, it would be very easy, right? I always joke about this, but because we don't read Maccabees on Hanukkah, we're stuck with really reaching far for what our Torah reading on Hanukkah is. We end up reading the sacrifices on Sukkot, right? There's all, right, the dedication of the tabernacle on the 8th day, right? There's all these interesting readings that the rabbis are sort of desperately looking for, of what religious text and inspiration can we read on Hanukkah, when you could almost imagine the book of Maccabees sitting there on the bookshelf screaming, like, what about me, right? I was written at the same time as a lot of these later books, but for a variety of reasons, right? And maybe next year Hanukkah, we could talk about this. The rabbis had very little interest in spreading Hanukkah more than it had already spread, probably because a lot of the corruption of the Hasmonean dynasty. And so the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls not containing the book of Esther shows you that this was still at a point of Jewish history where it would have been acceptable to say, well, thank you, but no thank you to the book of Esther, right? We like our Exodus and Deuteronomy with our much more simplistic or straightforward philosophy and theology, right? We don't need this iconoclastic heterodox book that perhaps will challenge our religious principles. Just taking a step back before we get into the way that the Talmud deals with Esther and really the way in which I think our tradition reads the book of Esther and Tanakh. Any thoughts or questions up until this point? I think you were on mute. Oh, go for it.
Yeah, no. So the I always knew that Esther was not found in the Qumran caves, but it was never clear to me that was, because there were for some of the books there were literally only fragments. So for others there were many copies, as you noticed, which is also really interesting also. But I didn't. So that may not have been a valuable book to them, but you're really suggesting that the sanctity of 10. So if it wasn't canonized by then, would you say that it was the very last book to enter the canon, and that would have been after the destruction of the temple or and the collapse of the? I've heard different theories. I'm interested to know what you think.
Yeah, of course, with all these things, I don't know, right? Anyone else's here's guesses. From a historical perspective, I don't have any deeper insight. I actually here I can for anyone interested, I wrote an essay about this in grad school about why the book of Esther was missing from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I went through all. I won't scroll through this 15-page paper here for everyone. But I went through all the theories of why, right? And theories range from exactly what you said, right? It was an accident and one day they'll find it, all the way to no, there was staunch religious opposition to this book, all the way to, right, other theories as to, one of the most radical theories, which doesn't really make much sense, is perhaps even the book of Esther was actually written, later, which, the scholars are really in a knot here. It seems like it was purposeful. It seems like too big of a coincidence, right? Because we already know, right, just to think about the history here, right? The Septuagint was translated in the 2nd century BCE in Israel. And so this is probably 50 to 70 years before the Essenes broke off. So we already know from the Septuagint's reworking of the book that Esther was seen as problematic. And religious leaders that were perhaps more of a more conservative or, traditional theological bent already found this book and wanted to edit it because, for a whole variety of reasons, right, as we said before, it's problematic. And so it just makes sense that if you're already breaking off, the Essenes did a lot of things that are not traditional. They completely forewent animal sacrifices. This is at a time when the temple's still up and running. There's actually an interesting scholarly theory that the Essenes were a lot of the inspiration for early Christians. That's sort of beyond the scope of this conversation.
Marcia?
Marcia.
So I understand, okay, of the other books that were found in the Qumran caves, was Song of Songs there by that time? Or is that much later? Because it's Greek. It should have been there, right? Or some fragment of it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And Ruth is later, or?
No, Ruth is early. So this is after all the books in the Tanakh have been found. So yeah, they had here. I probably should have done this on my computer, but this is when I Googled which sections of Song of Songs were in the Qumran caves. You can see the verse fragments that scholars have gotten. So yeah, and it's similar as Marsha said. It's similar to a lot of other books where they didn't find the whole thing, but they found torn parchment.
So were there other sections found in Qumran? I was just there, so I keep trying to think, what did I read and what did I see while I was there in Israel? But were there other things found in the Qumran caves that were obviously not scriptural, not religious texts at all? Did anybody leave a laundry list? Is there anything else there that could be considered completely secular and not in the domain of religious writings?
Yeah, 100%. They estimate that there was about 1,000 different texts that were found there, and most of them are not what we consider scripture. And so there was a lot of political polemics, right? They hated there was a guy, I'm forgetting exactly what they called him. It was like the master of darkness or the figure of darkness or something. There was this vague person in Jerusalem that they just hated, right? And it's a debate about whether or not this was the high priest or maybe a king or something. And so, right, a lot of political polemics. There's a lot of biblical commentaries, right? One of the famous ones, there's a commentary on the book of Habakkuk, which is one of the minor prophets, which, I mean, it's a book that like no one reads because it's so dense and full of, futuristic messianic visions. And it's one of those books that you skim and you say, what is this talking about? But of course, this community was also very messianic. And so they wrote this, long commentary on it. And so, yeah, the majority of books found in Qumran were not part of the Tanakh. And so we don't even know, I mean, just to lay all my cards on the table, we don't know if the other 23 sections of Tanakh books meant that all 23 of these were codified in the Tanakh or canonized already. All that means is that this community either found, let's say, Song of Songs inspirational, and so they brought it, or it was after a point where Song of Songs had already, passed the historical litmus test. And once it passes the historical litmus test, you can no longer say, well, throw out this book, right? You're in a sense stuck with it, from that perspective.
So whether they brought it as love poetry or something else, I mean, it seems like it's very not within the nature of that community to bring along love poetry just to have something cozy to read at night.
Yeah, perhaps, or maybe it was found in one of the elders, closet by his bed or something. But yeah, I mean, you're right. Meaning scholars obviously don't know in what context they have these books, and so. But yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating. I mean, I joked last time. I mean, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has probably sparked hundreds of careers in archaeology because it's just so fascinating to and you can go. I mean, even for anyone who's been to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem today, right? You can see a lot of the. I don't think they actually still have the originals there. The originals are underground, but copies of the originals, and it's really fascinating. So just to conclude here, so we have, right, this will just be the last source. So even by the time of the Talmud, and this will be something we'll discuss a lot more next week. So we'll start off with the same source, where we have this debate about whether or not books in the Tanakh render the hands impure. And next week, I'll go a little bit more into why that's the case. But counterintuitively, if a book is holy, it renders the hands impure, right? The sages made a decree, right? They didn't want Rabbi Marsha to get home after a long day at shul and sit down and just put all of her religious texts on her kitchen table and then start eating dinner and perhaps get some crumbs into the books. And so the sages said, well, all those books are ritually impure and nobody wants to have ritually impure material next to their dinner. And so you would have to get home, stow it away in an ark, and then, right, you would counterintuitively, by making the books ritually impure, you would actually treat them better, right? This is actually one clue that when the sages talk about pure and impure, it's not a morally good or morally bad. And so this is one of the interesting sources here, because a Torah scroll is actually ritually impure, right? That's a longer conversation. And so the sages are debating, and the sages say, Rabbi Yehuda tells us that the book of Esther does not render the hands impure. And so he says, although the sages issued a decree that sacred scrolls render hands ritually impure, the book of Esther was not accorded the sanctity of sacred scrolls. And so we still see, right, in the time of the Babylonian Talmud, that there are opinions in our tradition that say Esther is no longer or has never been holy writ. Now, just to unshare my screen to conclude here, right, this perspective obviously was rejected, right? Not to spoil the end here, but the book of Esther obviously was accepted into the Jewish canon, right? There's no denomination, no group of Jews today that does not have the book of Esther. And so we take a step back and we reflect on, again, the theme, and we'll discuss this more next week, is what are these later books doing here? And I think the maturity of a tradition to understand that there's a multiplicity of ways to connect with that tradition is a crucial step in terms of Jewish evolution. And what I mean by that is the book of Esther is not everybody's cup of tea. And today in the Jewish community, right, we think about the ways in which different community institutions function. And there are some in the Jewish community that say, being Jewish to me is entering into the public sphere and political activism and saying, it's up to us to change the world, right? Much the same way that Mordecai tells Esther, right? Perhaps it was for this moment that you are here, right? And so the modality of Jewish life becomes public service, political activism, all of these things. And somebody else can say, no, being Jewish is actually the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, right? It's very ritualistic, theological, right? Jewish law, all of these things. And what I think Jewish tradition is trying to tell us by encompassing the book of Esther, and next week we'll talk about the book of Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes, is it's advocating implicitly for a big picture or big tent Jewish community that says we actually want to have both. We actually want to cultivate a tradition that has room for Deuteronomy and has room for Esther. And even though no person can honestly read the book of Esther and Deuteronomy and think that they are espousing the same worldview, you say, that's great. I want there to be Deuteronomy and Esther on my bookshelf. I want there to be the person in my synagogue who's the Deuteronomist and the person in my synagogue who is the Estherist, and for them every single day to show up debating about, do you say thoughts and prayers and try to pray your way out of calamity? Do you try to enter into the political sphere and advocate your way out of calamity, right? All of these debates in which, right, we can go endlessly down. By including this expansive view of books, our tradition almost sets us up for what we now all know to be true in Judaism, right? We say 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And I don't think this is a historical accident, right? And so maybe just going back to how we open, and this will be the last thing I say, maybe in terms of which exact books ended up being important, maybe there's some randomness there. But the fact that we have 24 books that give 24 different philosophies, which then continues into rabbinic literature, where on every issue you have multiplicity of ideas, which then continues to medieval, where you have hundreds of different opinions, to the Jewish community we have now, where I wouldn't even bother asking the 22 people in this Zoom if there's any religious precept that we agree on, because we would be here endlessly debating, right? I don't think that's a mistake, right? I think that was embedded and sewed into the fabric of Jewish life. And so we'll continue this argument next week, but the book of Esther sets us up where we see that the book of Esther could have been edited away. It could have been thrown out and left behind in Jerusalem, right, after the destruction of the temple. But our tradition decided that we actually want Esther. We don't want Esther because now we're all Estherites and secular and atheist, as the book of Esther reads. But we want the book of Esther because we say that is one such way to be a Jew. And you don't have to say, do you choose Deuteronomy or nothing, right? You give more options. And so to some extent, the book of Esther, right, I always love the interplay, especially with Purim and Passover, because they're 2 stories that are just so different. I mean, one story is all people-centric, one story is all God-centric. And there's this will actually be the last thing I say, because I said that in a minute, I know we're 2 minutes past time. There's a fascinating read almost of the Jewish calendar, where Nisan famously, at least biblically, is the first month of the year. And so we go from, having to quite literally be handheld by God out of Egypt, and God is doing everything. And the Israelites just seem like they can't do anything right? God has to, rain down food. God has to split the ocean. God has to pacify them when they're afraid of the Egyptians, right? They're complaining, right? You almost imagine the Israelites as 6-year-olds leaving Egypt in terms of their maturity and their complaining. And there's a slow evolution, right? And, if we had more time to go through the calendar, we can see how the different holidays match into this, where all of a sudden we get to Purim, and now we have embedded these religious values so deeply that perhaps we no longer need the hand-holding, and we don't need the food to fall from the sky, and we don't need God to come in and say, okay, free the slaves, I'm going to punish the Egyptians, because now it's our turn, right? We have to be the quote-unquote godliness figures that go, and when we see injustice, say, this is not okay, right? Rather than saying, well, let's wait for God to send the 10 plagues and to split the ocean. So thank you all for being here this morning. I'm excited for next week.
Yes. So just a couple things. First of all, I'm so glad you were here. It is such a joy to learn with you, Daniel. I mean, and even for those of us, I think, who've, studied this every which way to Tuesday. It's very exciting to sort of be part of your scholarship. And I would say that the typology that you talked about the journey from handholding in Nisa to complete autonomy and total assimilation, but still knowing that you're Jewish in Adar, that whole thing. And then you have to go back again because, you have to start all over again. You could use the same thing between Tishrei and Elul the following year. So I'd love to have that conversation with you. We will look forward to seeing all of you again next week. There are 3 more classes of Jewish history with Daniel. All of them, all 19, will be recorded. You can access them on the Jewish Collaborative YouTube. Really a wonderful journey through Jewish history, through this brilliant mind. And but please
So great
join.
to see you. I'm so sorry I have to run because I forgot that I had a
thank you.
10:30 supposed to be interviewing somebody. So
Bye, Dan.
I will see you
Thank you.
all next week.
Anyway,
Thank you all.
thank
Happy
you all.
belated
And
Purim.
Bye, everybody. Marcia,
Thank
I'm going
you.
to give you a call right now, and have a great week, everyone.
But there's no